Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary, some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
A New England powerhouse, a controversial title nearly a century before Belichick and Brady got to Boston. Only a 7-year-old lifespan in the National Football League. 2 legendary Hall of Famers, 1 steamroller. The team dates back to 1925, a small market region of the country with no football presence, setting the stage for a historic town that would eventually dominate the sports universe. Revolutionizing the game of professional football with no idea what was in store for the eventual world's biggest sports platform. This is the tall tale of the Providence Steam Roller.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. How are you? It's Good Seats Still Available. It's the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I am your humble and congenial host, Tim Hanlon. Thank you for finding us. And football is on the brain. There's just too much of it out there going on with the bowl season approaching and the NFL playoffs coming into view. All kinds of stuff in the football realm. And why not go back to one of the earliest teams in the NFL? Let's get this story straight, shall we? It is the story of the Providence Steam Roller, or is it Steamrollers? We'll talk about that with our guest this week, Greg Tranter. He, the author of the relatively brand new book devoted to this team's history. Bet you didn't even know that Providence, Rhode Island had an NFL franchise, did you? It's called the Providence Steam Roller, New England's first NFL team. Yes, of course. And why is this important? Well, of course, it's what we do around here. We focus on and obsess about teams and situations and leagues and all that kind of stuff that don't exist anymore. And boy, oh boy, this one hits the radar smack dab into our little mindset here. This is a team that for about 9 years or so was one of those rollicking clubs that were in the, call them semi-independent or semi-pro, the sort of ragtag existence that this early days professional / semi-professional / amateur football thing was. And in 1925, when this National Football League thing was starting to congeal, they joined forces, and the Providence Steamroller became a very interesting team in the early days of NFL, including, of course, can't go without mentioning that the team won the NFL championship in 1928. And this is a very interesting story of the rough and tumble days of pre-professional football, but then the early days of being professional football in an interesting set of circumstances. For one, a stadium called the Cycledrome. Yes, this was a cycle arena where cyclists would perform. That's where the Providence Steamroller played. Interesting contraption there. We'll talk about that with Greg. A couple of NFL and pro football Hall of Famers, college football Hall of Famers too, for that matter. People like Fritz Pollard, we will talk about, and Jimmy Conzelman, we will talk about. Conzelman, a pro football Hall of Fame member, not a college one. But Fritz and Jimmy were instrumental. We'll talk about their contributions to this team, both on and off the field. And an interesting character named Peter Laudati, who was a sports promoter and part owner of this team. It was his idea for constructing the Cycledrome in the first place, Cyclodome, excuse me. He was a Providence real estate guy, developer. He also built Kinsley Park in Providence for the Providence Grays baseball team of the 30s. He was instrumental in bringing the Yankees to playing exhibition game at that park with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig back in the day, etc. All kinds of interesting characters in this story of the Providence Steamroller, and again, steamrollers, some connotations there where they might be the plural. one of the more interesting and intriguing franchises. And that clip that you heard there came from a little mini documentary that I highly encourage you to seek out on YouTube. That is produced by the Pro Football Hall of Fame. A guy named Eric Welschenbach has posted that. It's called One Steamroller, and it's great. It's full of interesting history, but also some clips, some actual early footage of 1920s football, and it is a sight to behold for sure. But our conversation is with Greg Tranter. We're going to be talking about the steamroller, and I also got to mention that Greg Tranter is also a memorabiliist for the Buffalo Bills in their various incarnations, not just the NFL version, but the various versions there that were prior to that. And if you live in Buffalo, have ever been to Buffalo, or fancy yourself going to Buffalo at some point in the near future, you should run and not walk to check out the Buffalo History Museum, where you will find the Greg D. Tranter collection of Buffalo Bills memorabilia. All kinds of stuff. And you can go to buffalohistory.org and check out a sampling of those things. But all kinds of objects and archival items that are part of that collection. And some of them are digitized for you to check out on the website there. But Greg is he's deep into the history of this kind of stuff, and the Buffalo Bills certainly being part of it. But the steamroller, arguably has a bit of a contribution to the Bills' history. It certainly has a tributary of history to contribute to what is now known as the New England Patriots, too. A lot of people think that the first pro football team in the New England area were the AFL were the AFL Boston Patriots, but that's not the case. Providence much more earlier on the scene, and that's what we're going to get into our conversation. So make sure you get a copy of this book for sure. You can go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode that we posted up there. Episode number 374 with Greg, and you'll find a couple of convenient links to the paperback and or Kindle versions from Amazon. And again, it's called the Providence Steam Roller, New England's first NFL team. All right, so let's talk about this team, shall we? Here we go. It's a conversation that we had, about 2 months ago. We're only now able to get it to you. The book has been available since late September, but here's our conversation with Greg. Please, as always, be fascinated like me and enjoy. The Providence Steamroller story, I think for maybe, those crusty and dedicated souls devoted to pro football research and the Pro Football Researchers Association certainly may know of this. But I think to the average NFL fan or football fan generally have no clue about this team that has made a lot of lasting marks on the National Football League, albeit in the earliest years, and is a very interesting story. Tell the audience a little bit about your background and how you became interested in this story of the Providence Steamroller.
So I'm a sports historian. And have been actually on and off for a long time. It's become my full-time occupation over the last 10 years. And that from
what though? That implies that you were doing this on the side in parallel with something else you were doing maybe as the day job.
Yes, I was a chief operations officer for a property casualty insurance company. So nothing to do with this.
Yeah, perfect background for this story. No, go ahead.
Right. And so a sports historian, been a member of the Pro Football Researchers Association for 25 plus years, was a major collector of Buffalo Bills memorabilia, actually the largest collection in the world. Because I grew up in Western New York and became a Bills fan as a 8-year-old. And just loved it and started collecting. And of course, I love history. So I started to put together a collection that kind of captured the history of the franchise. So that was where my passion was. I've actually written 5 sports books related to Buffalo sports, mostly the Bills, but some deviation from that. But anyway, I went back to school 10 years ago to get a master's in museum administration. So that I could learn the museum business before I would know what to do with my collection. And I eventually donated it. But as part of my education, I had to do an internship, and I chose an internship at the International Tennis Hall of Fame in Newport, Rhode Island. And I worked for a guy there named Doug Stark, who was the executive director and who was a huge New England sports fan. So fast forward a few years, I go down to the Tennis Hall of Fame and volunteer for their enshrinement week. And Doug knew I was a football guy. So he asked me if I knew why the steamroller nickname was used by so many Providence professional sports teams. It's been used by 6 different ones. And my response was no, that I knew a little bit about the Providence Steamroller from the NFL, but not a lot. So he piqued my curiosity, and I started researching the steamroller name, but mostly focused on the NFL team. And the more I researched, the more enthralled I got with the story. And I came back to him and I said, I think this is book worthy. I said, as long as you'll help me navigate Providence, because I don't know anybody there. And he said, sure. And so that was 2021, in the summer of 2021, that we had that conversation. And it was about a year later that I started to really get serious about writing the book. And it took about 18 months for me to do all the research and to write the book that is now published.
See, this is a fascinating story. Okay, so we'll have to entertain you at some point in the future to go deeper into the earliest parts of the history of the Buffalo Bills and maybe Buffalo sports proper. We've done stuff on various stories around Buffalo, both the Bills, the AFL version, and all kinds of other stuff related to minor league baseball, and even little Buffalo Stallions and the MISL, all that kind of stuff. But I digress. I think it's fascinating that you sort of made that career turn / twist into something that you're passionate about, at least on a personal level. But what makes a guy who decides to go into the museum studies field, at least from an educational perspective, ultimately decide to donate that stuff to describe it? Because I see it online. It's stayed locally in Buffalo. I'm curious as to how you make that decision to make that donation there, and not maybe curate it yourself.
Well, what really, a couple of things came about. One is in 2008, I had proposed to the History Museum in Buffalo to do a 50th anniversary exhibit for the Bills, because it was the 50th anniversary of the team and the AFL. And I told them, I said, look, I can provide all the artifacts for the exhibit. So to make a long story short, we did a 50th anniversary exhibit. It was the largest attended exhibit in the 150-year history of the museum. And during that, I was a docent and I did tours. And every time I did a tour, every person that came in saw some object in the collection and they had a personal story to tell. And when we packed up it after 6 months, it was like, this belongs in Buffalo. It belongs to the community because everybody has a story. And that's when I decided to go back to school to learn the museum field. And at the same time, I kind of considered, and I looked into and actually formed a not-for-profit corporation in case I did want to go it myself. But when I got deeper into it and had more of my education, I knew that was going to be a $10 million endeavor. I don't have that kind of money. I didn't have that kind of time to go try to raise that kind of money. I had built a relationship with the History Museum through the exhibit. And so I approached them and they obviously wanted it. And they agreed to do a permanent exhibit, which has now been on exhibit for this is year 7 of the exhibit being up at the History Museum. And so that's why I ultimately decided to donate it. And it is a complete history of the team from its founding in 1959 up until the present day.
I find that endlessly fascinating, and I want to return to that topic in another conversation. So let's put a push pin into that. But it's interesting though that through your internship in the realm of tennis, that ultimately sideways gets you to an early team in the NFL and even prior to the NFL's history in Providence, Rhode Island, not necessarily a stone's throw from Buffalo. But it almost feels like this was a challenge given to you, maybe on purpose or maybe inadvertently. But how did you approach this project then to get to this original nomenclature known as of the steamroller? And how do you even go about sort of researching and then getting your proverbial nails dirty with some of the bits and pieces of what I'm assuming was not necessarily an easy story to sort of cull together really easily in the beginning?
Yeah, I to a great extent, there was some luck involved here. So I started my research with online, pulling up Providence Steam Roller, Google searching it and finding whatever they had. And then I have a subscription to newspapers.com, which of course has a lot of newspapers online. And so I looked at those. The sad news is they didn't have the Providence Journal. So most of what I was getting was from, Boston papers and Worcester papers and stuff like that. And the opponent team's papers. Then I went to the Rhode Island Historical Society, and this is where I got really lucky. So the Rhode Island Historical Society had access to the Providence Journal, so I could get all the stuff that the Providence Journal might have produced.
Microfiche?
It also, I'm sorry?
Microfiche?
No, actually online access.
Oh, that's great. See, I would like to say the word microfiche because it's something that nobody remembers anymore, but okay. Sorry.
Yes. But no, it was, and what was interesting about the Providence Journal, way before it became common practice, they had a beat reporter that covered the team every day. So there was a wealth of information in the Providence Journal, and they covered the team in detail, the games in detail. Like only the Green Bay paper at the same time was covering their team in that kind of depth. So that was great. That was really great. The second thing is Peter Laudati, who was one of the co-owners of the team and who built the stadium that they played in called the Cycledrome. He left his personal papers to the Rhode Island Historical Society. In addition to that, the assistant general manager, a guy named Pierce B. Johnson, who gave the idea to Charles Coppin, who became the original owner, he's the one who gave him the idea to start the team. Pierce B. Johnson left his papers, a combination, some of them to the Rhode Island Historical Society and some to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And between those two papers, I got unbelievable information about salaries, how much people were paid, what their ticket revenue was, what their concession revenue was, all the different players, how they signed them, how they cut them. And then they had some great, like the Rhode Island Historical Society, between the Rhode Island Historical Society and the Pro Football Hall of Fame, they have almost every program in the team's history. So it was just a wealth of information that my guess is probably not available for almost any other early NFL team.
That's amazing. And that's got to be, you must have been just giddy and then probably going down many rabbit holes and then probably not doing the actual work of writing the book because you stumbled across all of this great stuff, right?
Oh yeah, no, for sure. And then the more I uncovered, the more interesting the story, became. And I tell some of those stories, in the book. Like, for example, when they took a steamer from Providence to New York to play at Yankee Stadium in, I think it was 1927. On the return trip for after the game was over, that they beat the New York Yankees, one of the steamroller players fell overboard. And so they had to try to rescue him, and luckily they did, but the player remained unnamed. And so there's a bunch of like stories like that you would, were never publicized, of course, in the paper, so you would never know. But they were in the papers of those two, gentlemen.
Well, tell me about this. Tell me about this, Peter Laudati, is it?
Yeah. So Peter Laudati was one of the co-owners.
I'm sorry. He strikes me as like a sort of like almost like the unofficial. I won't call him mayor, but almost like the the patron of Providence sports and culture during his era.
Yeah, well, so he was a real estate developer, but also a sports promoter, and he actually built two stadiums. He built the Cycledrome, which was actually built as a bicycle arena, not as a football field, because bicycling back in the 20s was immensely popular. At the time they built the Cycledrome, it was the largest bicycle track in the country because it held 12,000 people. Prior to that, he built Kinsley Park, which is where the pre-NFL steamroller team played. So the steamroller was founded in 1916 as an independent professional team. And they didn't join the NFL until 1925. During that period, they played most of the time from like 1921 on, they played at Kinsley Park, which is a stadium that Laudaddy had built, but it only held 5,000 or 6,000. So when they wanted to join the NFL, he knew they needed a bigger facility.
Interesting. And describe this I guess you call it arena, right? It also had multiple other sports besides football. My understanding from the stuff that I've read was that it was how can I best describe it for football? Snug.
Yes, it was very tight, which gave a distinct advantage to the steamroller at home, because of the bicycle tracks, the fans were very close to the action. In fact, there were parts of the field where if the player got tackled, they were tackled into the stands if they were tackled on the sidelines. And for example, in the end zones were only 5 yards deep because of the curvature in the track. And so, of course, that made it interesting too. Not that back in those days, it wasn't a big passing game. So you didn't have guys not having enough room in the end zone to catch a pass or something. But, and, when they were in their heyday and in their really good years of like 27, 28, 29, they pretty much packed the place, especially for, the bigger opponents that they played.
It's interesting. It almost feels like maybe with a hard squint, an early version of maybe the arena version of the game, given those tight quarters and stuff, and people going off the sides and stuff. That's just crazy. But I gotta think though that it also made for I guess a bit more. And I know this is still the earliest days of the professional game, right? But it had to make for a more intimate kind of fan experience, perhaps, versus some of the just larger fields that maybe just had, maybe bleachers or less enclosed approaches to fan comfort.
Right. And it was also one of the first stadiums where you walked in on the mezzanine and then walked down to your seats. That was something relatively new at the time when the stadium was built. And again, I think that was because it was a bicycle track, which you needed a deeper, stadium because of that.
So what was Laudaddy's, what was his impetus for, I mean, it seems like he had his hand in a bunch of different things in and around sports. It seems like he was some kind of a not only a developer, but a promoter of things. And why football in particular versus, say, other events in sports and or cycling for that matter?
Well, he was brought into the ownership group by Charles Coppin. So Coppin was the sports editor of the Providence Journal at the time. And as I mentioned, Pierce B. Johnson, who was a schoolboy reporter for the Journal, went to a semi-pro football game in Massachusetts, and they were drawing 3,000 or 4,000 people. And he came into work following that game and said to his boss, Coppin, Providence should have a pro football team because this is a semi-pro team and we would easily draw 3,000 or 4,000 fans, I think, or many more. So Coppin said, great idea. And then he brought Laudaddy in, and he brought James Dooley, who was the attorney for the club. He was a local judge and a state legislator. And actually he brought pari-mutuel betting to Rhode Island. And you may have heard of Narragansett Racetrack, which was one of the most prominent racetracks in the country for many, many years. He eventually became the director of Narragansett Raceway.
Very interesting.
So these were three very prominent people in Rhode Island.
Yeah, very interesting and almost very, culturally determinative in terms of bringing sports and facilities and that kind of stuff. So, all right, so explain this team in its pre-NFL days, right? You're mentioning that it was sort of was it semi-pro? Was it sort of pro? I mean, I think we've had a number of interesting conversations previously that kind of get into sort of the earliest days of what this football thing was like on a semi to fully professional level. But prior to the NFL's creation in 1920, actually, it wasn't even called the NFL until a couple of years later.
Right.
There was this very robust, I guess you could call it post-collegiate kind of a play, almost more of a traveling team kind of thing that was not quite amateur, but it wasn't quite fully pro yet either. And I guess that's sort of the dynamic that they were their first years where they were playing in.
Well, and interesting that you say that, because I think they did play a myriad of different teams. They played semi-pro teams, they played other pro teams, and they played NFL teams. But from the beginning, the ownership group committed to paying all the players that played. They wanted this to be a fully professional outfit. And so, I mean, guys were paid $2.50, but they were paid. So every player was paid from 1916 forward. One of the interesting stories was how they got the name Steamroller, because they were initially called the Providence Pros until like the second or third game that they played. And Providence was winning by a lot at halftime. Charles Coppin was in line at one of the concession stands, and he overheard two fans talking about the game. And the one guy said to the other, "Oh, Providence is steamrolling Fort Adams." And Coppin overheard that and was like, "Oh, that's the name of our team." And from that point forward, they were called the Steamroller. And it was like the third week of the season, the Providence Journal started calling them the Steamroller. And it's not plural. Coppin was very strong about this is a singular nickname, which arguably is the first singular nickname in the NFL. But of course, this happened in 1916. And they carried that name, obviously, throughout their existence. The teams that follow the NFL team actually make it plural. But he was adamant that it was singular because you were steamrolling the other team.
And what was I'm the fact that they were drawing such decent crowds and stuff. I mean, and arguably it's probably more of an exhibition. I mean, it wasn't really a schedule. It was a schedule, but it wasn't no standings or anything. I mean,
yeah.
the sport of football around the New England region and Providence in particular, I guess the popularity of it was pretty strong to at least birth a team that would play that kind of a schedule and then ultimately go into an actual league.
Yeah. And it was, 1916, 17, 18, you're dealing with World War I. Their schedule was a little bit inconsistent. There was some years they would play 8 or 9 games, or some years they only played 4. But when you get into the 20s, 22, 23, 24, they start playing, 13 games, 15 games. And there is a number of teams. Bridgeport had a very good team. Boston had a team called Pierre Marquette, which was very good. And so by the time you get to 23, Providence was 12-1, and they were considered the mythical Eastern champions. It was almost like college football, right? You kind of voted for the teams that were the best. And then in 1924, the team was looking to get into the NFL, but they felt they needed to prove to the NFL that they were worthy. So they scheduled 6 NFL teams. And they actually ended up with a winning record. They won 3 games, lost 2, and tied 1. But they also drew good crowds to Kinsley Park to show the NFL that we're worthy and we're ready to join the league. And again, they were considered the mythical Eastern Eastern champions, because they were again, I think only lost one game to a non-NFL team that season as well.
All right, so in 1924, we're talking about this now, I guess, then newly named or renamed NFL agreeing to be to have some of their teams play. I'm guessing Providence wasn't the only non-league team that these NFL franchises were playing in this kind of format. No,
that's correct. Because if you think of the NFL in those days, of course, there was no television, so their revenue was ticket sales. And so they would play, and even after Providence joined the NFL, they played a number of games against non-NFL teams. And a lot of times, like for example, one year, Providence traveled to Green Bay to play the Packers. Well, on the way home, they stopped in two different cities to play other non-NFL teams for a payday. For, the players made more money, and, the team made revenue, and it helped offset the cost of the trip to Green Bay to play only one game. And again, in those days, they didn't wait a week to play a game. They would play games back to back on a weekend. In fact, one of the records that the steamroller broke back in 1929 and still hold today is they played 4 NFL games in 6 days. Imagine that.
well, and that was in a schedule, right? That was, I mean, but then again, the you put a schedule in quotes, right? Because it was a much more, to your point, loosely created kind of dynamic, and to take advantage of some of those games, if you will, in between or on the side, and given
Right.
travel issues.
And in the case with the 4 to 6, they had one of the games got rained out the week before. Well, they didn't want to cancel it, so they just moved it to when the weather was supposed to be better, and that created the 4 and 6 days. Plus, part of that 4 and 6 days, Providence hosted the first ever night game in NFL history on November 6th, 1929. And they played at Kinsley Park because the Cycledrome had a bunch of water issues from rain for a few days before. And they didn't want to lose the payday because they knew they were going to get a good night crowd. So they just scheduled the game a couple days later at Kinsley Park. And they drew, basically a capacity crowd, which for Kinsley Park was about 6,000 people at the time. And they played the Chicago Cardinals. Ernie Nevers, Hall of Famer, scored all 16 points, and Providence lost 16-0. But it was considered a significant success. And the following year, the Steamroller put in permanent floodlighting, first NFL team to ever do that. And they played 4 night games in 1930, 40 years before NFL's Monday Night Football.
That's amazing. So take me back though to 1924, right? This is the last season that they were a quote unquote independent team. But by that time, right, they had garnered enough attention by people in the football realm, right? They were essentially, I mean, were they the best independent team in the country at that point? I mean, I'm sure there was a lot of,
I don't know if I could say they were the best in the country. They were clearly the best in the Northeast. Without a doubt, because they played a couple games at the end of the season against the other considered 2 best teams, Pierre Marquette and Bridgeport, and beat them both. And so they were definitely the best in this part of the country. I'd have to do more research to make a judgment about whether they might have been the best, in the country. But they would have definitely competed against anybody because their 2 losses were to the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, who finished with an 11-2-1 record in the NFL, and they didn't get blown out in either of those games.
All right, so I got 2 questions there in that regard. Number one, where are these players coming from, right? Because they're not quite pro, but they're not quite amateur, but they kind of are, right? I would imagine that with college football becoming quite a thing around that time, and really kind of establishing its grip on certainly on the collegiate level, there was amateurism still, right? But we've heard stories, right, where there would be some, shall we say, yes. So to explain that.
Yeah. So, I mean, college football was actually way more popular in 1924 than professional football was. But the vast majority of the players, especially before they join the NFL, when they get into the NFL, they recruit further. But their players on the 1923 and 24 team are almost exclusively Rhode Island, Massachusetts, a couple players, maybe from Vermont or Maine, but the vast majority were right here, or they were within a train ride, a same day train ride to get to the stadium. And yeah, there was back certainly in the early 20s, there was a number of college players that would play under assumed names. And they would play a college game on Saturday, and then they would get paid to play on Sunday. The other thing that would be important to note is in the teens and 20s, Brown University was a juggernaut. They played in the first Rose Bowl. They had their 1926 team was called the Iron Men because they basically played 11 guys the whole time. They went undefeated. And Brown was a great feeder to the steamroller. 18 players from Brown played on the steamroller during their NFL seasons, and 13 of them are in the Brown Athletic Hall of Fame. So they were drawing Brown's best collegiate players. And it mattered. Several of them had a lot to do with the championship that they ultimately won.
All right. So the other question I've got then from circa 1924 is who's feeling out who, so to speak, when it comes to possibly joining this very early days National Football League? I mean, is it Providence trying to prove themselves, or is it the NFL? I've got to think there were other independent teams out there that were similarly interested in joining, and maybe the NFL was like trying to just grow it slowly or not sure how to grow.
Yeah, no, what's interesting is when the Steamroller joined the NFL in 1925, they added 4 teams, the Steamroller being one of the 4. The New York Giants were one of the other teams that joined at the same time. And so the NFL was pretty open at that time as far as like if they felt you had the money and they felt you could draw fans, you could get into the league. It wasn't, anything like it would be today that you'd have to go through, which is why if you look at the 20s, the league's 22 teams one year, it's 12 teams, it's 16, it's 20. And so it fluctuates quite a bit because teams came and went. There were teams that would only last a year or only last 3 or 4 games. But I think Providence was very attractive to the NFL, one, because they had proven they could win on the field, and they had proven to a great extent that they could draw crowds. Their ownership group was, an impressive group of Rhode Island leaders. So I think all those things mattered. Plus, at the time, Providence was they were the 20th largest city in the United States and one of the wealthiest because they were one of the first cities to industrialize. And so they had major manufacturers like Fruit of the Loom, Gorham Manufacturing, Nicholson File. These were all major, manufacturing companies. And so I think the NFL was, thrilled that Providence was interested in joining and had, basically the fundamental capabilities to make a team successful.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at royalretros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's royalretros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at royalretros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. Well, there was also this first American Football League rattling around at that time too.
Right. With
C.C. Pyle, we've talked about in his cycling things and foot race the promotion stuff and all that stuff. I got to think there was a bit of I don't want to call it competition, but it just seems like there's lots of different opportunities for independent teams like this one to potentially, bring their boat into a harbor.
Yes. Well, and when you think about it, if you add the NFL, or the AFL, that was another 12 teams. So in 1925-26, there was actually like 34, legitimate like NFL kind of teams that were playing, which actually the demise of the AFL at the end of the 1926 season really jettisons Providence to where it really became good because they got several players from the AFL.
So that itself is interesting too. So I guess the only other sort of like little last thread of that questionnaire is what would attract a team like the Steamroller to put themselves into this league, fledgling as it might be, expanding and contracting, it seems, on an annual basis. The AFL coming and going so relatively quickly. And they're already being successful financially and with the fans and that kind of stuff in this more, unfettered kind of scheduling kind of thing. Why the rules, if you will, of a league like that wasn't even proven yet with the NFL?
Because they would get higher guarantees to play a team, or bringing in the Chicago Cardinals with Ernie Nevers would draw more fans, or bringing Red Grange in would draw more fans, which means they would make more money. So not unlike the NFL today, they made decisions because they thought they would increase their revenue by doing that. And so joining the NFL, that was the top of the food chain, even though it was still fledgling. It was the top of the food chain, and they could get higher guarantees if they went on the road, and they could draw more fans at home.
Well, explain the first couple of seasons, because they didn't necessarily take the NFL by storm per se. They didn't embarrass themselves by any means. They played fairly competitively, but they certainly didn't set those early years of the league on fire on the field.
No, and I mean 1925-26, they were basically a 500 team. They were winning half their games, losing half their games. Like the highlight of 1925, their first win at the Cycledrome was against the New York Giants, which at the time they were both expansion teams. But looking back on it, that's a pretty cool thing. Like, oh yeah, they beat the Giants, who are still around today. So that was big. The biggest win in 1925 was that was the year Red Grange was touring. It was his first tour with the Chicago Bears. And they played in New England. It was actually the first NFL game ever played in Boston. And they played at Boston Braves Field, which was the home of the Boston Braves baseball team. They drew about 18,000 fans, which at the time would be considered a large crowd. And they actually beat Red Grange's team 9-7, which was the first loss on his tour. They had played 7 games before they played the Steamroller and had not lost any. And so the Steamroller, in what was considered a pretty significant upset, beat the Bears and Red Grange in the first ever NFL game played in Boston.
And Red Grange at the time, he was kind of like the Lionel Messi or the Pele of football, right? At that point, I mean, he was a national star and then some.
Yeah, interesting. At the time, he in the pregame before the game in Boston, he met up with Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth was actually at the game, and at the time, they would have been considered the 2 biggest names in professional sports. In 1925. Which was kind of interesting. The other interesting story in that before the game, he had a meeting with Joseph P. Kennedy because Kennedy ran a film company and he was doing a movie on Red Grange. And of course, Joseph P. Kennedy is the father of JFK and Robert F. Kennedy. So Grange was in high company, to say the least.
And before we get to the championship season in 1928, how about where was the rivalry or rivalries for this team in these years?
They had two big rivalries. One was the Pottsville Maroons, and the other was the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets. And Frankfurt at the time was a suburb of Philadelphia. So you could almost think of them as the Philadelphia Eagles today, but those were their 2 major rivalries, and they played both teams home and home. So they would play Pottsville typically earlier in the season in Providence, and then they would play them on Thanksgiving Day, which was a big deal in Pottsville. And then the Yellow Jackets, they would typically play a home and home weekend series. They would play the Yellow Jackets in Frankfurt on Saturday because there was the Pennsylvania Blue laws, so they didn't allow football on Sundays. And then Frankfurt and Providence would ride a train overnight, come up to Providence, and play the next day. And they did that throughout the Steamrollers, time in the NFL.
Well, it's also interesting to me too that that Providence was where the NFL really had its roots for a number of years, and not Boston. There was a fleeting Boston franchise during Providence's existence. I think it was only for 1 season, though. I think, frankly, the Bulldogs even lasted truly one full season.
Yeah, it was like one. Yeah, it was like 1 year. And then after Providence was gone, they had another Boston team that turned into the Washington Redskins. But again, they only lasted in Boston about 4 years.
So that's amazing to me. I'm just wondering, like, I got to think that the team drew from Boston or maybe north of Providence. Nobody seemed to give as much care. I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't done an analysis to figure out how many people came from outside the area. I think one of the interesting parts of where they located the stadium on the Providence-Pawtucket line. And there was a major train depot right there. Because again, this is when most people were traveling by train. Sure, but by 1931, there were more cars and stuff, but still many of the people came by train. And so it was built by, there was a train depot right there. So how many people might have come down from Boston? Hard to know, but they certainly could have.
Yeah, and I guess it's also interesting in that regard too, because if you think about the emergence of the American Football League back in the 1960s, right? I mean, that's when Boston really. I mean, it's been an interesting dynamic to see how Boston, finally became, and the region then became sort of an NFL kind of stronghold. But we were talking about these days where it was really Providence and not sort of what most people would automatically sort of revert to and think that Boston was sort of the center of this. Tell me about 1928 then, because this is one of those interesting tidbits that you mentioned in the book and throughout the book that that this Providence Steamroller team has to its credit, and that was to be the last, I guess now defunct franchise to win an NFL championship. In this case, 1928.
Yes. Yeah, well, and the team really started to come together in 27. I mentioned that the AFL folded after the 1926 season, so the Steamroller was able to sign Jimmy Conzelman, who was both a star offensive player, but also was the player coach. So he was the head coach as well. And he had played for the Detroit Wolverines, who were one of the teams that folded. And then he brought multiple players with him, Gus Sonnenberg being the most noteworthy, because he was the guy that brought the nastiness to their defense. Think of like Dick Butkus or Mike Singletary or somebody like that. He brought that nastiness to their defense. And so they put together a winning streak at the end of the 27 season. And so they had their best record to date going into 1928. And then they started the 28 season. They won a game, and then they lost a close game to the Yellow Jackets that they led the entire game. And then the Yellow Jackets scored 10 points in the fourth quarter and pulled out the victory. Then the Steamroller went on a winning streak. They won their next 4 games over some good opponents, the Giants and a couple of other good teams. And then they had their home series with the Yellow Jackets in mid-November. And the Yellow Jackets at the time came into the game with a 7-1 record, and the Steamroller were 5-1. The first game they played on Saturday, the Steamroller scored in the fourth quarter behind a Wildcat Wilson, who was one of the players they got outside of Providence. They recruited him from the University of Washington. He had played in the AFL and was really considered almost on par with Red Grange as far as capabilities. So he was definitely one of the stars of the 1928 team. And he led them to a tying touchdown. And so they tied that game. And then the next day, the Steamroller at the Cycledrome beat the Yellow Jackets 7-0. And at the time, first place was decided by winning percentage because teams didn't play an equal number of games. And so when that game was completed, the Steamroller had the better winning percentage. And so pretty much all they had to do was not lose any of their last 3 games. The following week, they played the New York Giants, the largest crowd in the history of the Cycledrome. And they beat the Giants. And then they played Pottsville, and they won that game. And then they came home to play Green Bay. And the Packers, if you know your football history, 1929, 30, and 31, they won 3 consecutive NFL championships. So they were a good team in 1928. And the Steamroller needed to either win or tie to win the NFL championship. And 2 days before the game, Pierce B. Johnson's mother, who housed 7 of the players and treated them like her kids. She cooked for them. She did their laundry. She got groceries. I mean, she did everything for them. She was hit and killed by a streetcar 2 days before the championship game. The team was rightfully devastated. And it showed in the first half of the game. They were pretty listless. They trailed Green Bay 7-0 until late in the game. And the steamroller was able to put together a drive, got a touchdown, and then Gus Sonnenberg kicked the all-important extra point, which was, they didn't make 95% of the extra points in those days. It was a 50-50 proposition. He made the extra point, and the game ended in a 7-7 tie. And Providence was NFL champions. And Pierce Johnson did not attend the game. 2 days later, his mother was laid to rest with those 7 players as the pallbearers for her casket. And then the following day, they had a championship celebration at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Providence to celebrate the NFL championship.
So just explain again this standings thing. So this is back in the day when you said winning percentage was the determinant. But as also mentioned, right, there is an inequality, shall we say, in terms of the teams and how many games that they played. I mean, like the Chicago Cardinals that year played 6 games. They went 1-5. But Frankfurt played 16 games, and Providence only played 11, excuse me. So was there any controversy and or confusion about this, or did everybody recognize this and know that those were essentially the rules? You could play more games and hope to win more to aid and abet your winning percentage, or was this kind of a squeaker / asterisk kind of
by 1928 it was accepted as the standard. And teams scheduled
not
more
playing the same amount of games.
Right. But part of that was, like, for example, Curly Lambeau of the Packers did not like Providence because he wouldn't play them in Green Bay because they demanded such a high guarantee. And so he basically said, I'm not going to give you that guarantee. So they didn't play in Green Bay. So they only played a game in Providence. Well, they should have really played a game in Green Bay also. So there were those kind of things that were going on because the league didn't really manage the schedule. It was really the individual teams. It was much more controversial in the early years of the NFL, 1920 to 25, because there wasn't a clear definition of who was in the league and who wasn't. And so it was a little bit more sketchy. And so I think it's 4 of the first 5 NFL championships were decided by a vote of the owners. And it wasn't really decided by winning percentage or anything that you could put your finger on. I mean, I could tell you a whole story about 1921 when George Halas stole the championship from the Buffalo All-Americans, but that's a whole nother story. But he just leveraged the owners to vote for him, even though Buffalo had a better team and a better record. But by 1928, it was clear that they were NFL champions when they tied the Packers.
So what? Okay, so a great story. They've won the championship. It's not as contested as maybe a naive amateur historian like me looks back and maybe questions. Why then the decline? We obviously know what happened in 1929 economically in this country, and the years that came after that, which certainly challenged all kinds of sports and public events and that kind of stuff, and the economic condition of the country. But what happened to this team after 28? There essentially was their pinnacle. There are a bunch of different factors to this, including some players that had some side gigs going on too in their lives.
Right. So Konzelman was injured in the 28 season and never returned to his playing ability in 1929 or 30, even though he continued to coach the team. They lost Gus Sonnenberg, who I said was like losing Dick Butkus, because he was a professional wrestler and he won the World Wrestling Championship on January 4th, 1929. And then he devoted his career to wrestling because he could make a lot more money wrestling than he could playing pro football.
Beating the very famous Ed Strangler Lewis.
Yes, in a rematch that he had lost earlier.
Yeah, and we've had some interesting conversations about that too, because at that point it was like boxing and wrestling were like totemic in terms of their popularity and stuff, and it wasn't this. While there was a little bit of the sort of drama and theatrics sort of creeping in, it really hadn't taken hold yet. It was still looked upon as largely legit, this wrestling thing.
Right, right. So the steamroller lost some very key players from 28 to 29. And then, as you mentioned, though the depression didn't hurt them much in 1929, they were still drawing good crowds. I think they had, quote, the championship hangover, right? Both from a crowd point of view, they had good crowds, but they didn't play as well in 1929. Though they were still a competitive team, but certainly not a championship team. When they get to 1930, more players have left and gone away. And they were really, by 1930, they were somewhat a shell of the team from 1928. And other players jumped leagues, they jumped teams. So there was a lot of movement from year to year. And of course, I probably should also say, like, the year they won the championship, their roster was 20 players. The NFL rosters were 20 players in those days. And so if you lose 5 or 6 good players, it's not like you got, 35 players and you got a whole bunch of others that are ready to play. You got to go out and recruit new ones.
Well, no, and these are a lot of two-way players, right? Too. The era of specialists wasn't even close.
Right. No, exactly. Everybody was playing both ways. And then if you get a couple injuries, that also is certainly a factor. And so, they just weren't as good. So the crowds in 29 went down some. In 1930, they went down a lot. They were averaging close to 10,000 fans in, 1927, 28. And by 1930, they were down to around 5,000. So again, and you're trying to recruit new players, you got to pay them. And so they couldn't necessarily get the same quality of player. And then some of their star players for 28 that were still on the team, like Wildcat Wilson, wasn't near as good by 1930 that he was in 1928. So players aged, and, they didn't have 10 and 15-year careers in those days, at least not the vast majority. And then by 1931, the Depression had fully taken hold. There was 30% unemployment. Again, their attendance dropped. They played a lot more non-league games, trying to increase revenue, but those games didn't draw well. They might get 2,000 fans against a non-NFL team, or 2,500. They weren't getting 8 or 10,000 like they would have gotten, 3 or 4 years earlier. And so, it was really the Depression that, ultimately led them to their ultimate demise.
And why? And a couple other questions before we wrap up. But why do you think that it, even after the Depression and Second World War and then the 1950s and all why do you think that Providence never regained a pro football franchise at that point, and maybe even why it took until 1960 and the Challenger AFL for even Boston to sort of get to that sort of regular and sustained, level, having a few franchises sort of come and go.
Well, I think, the Providence never really recovered from the Depression as a city. The manufacturing never came back to the degree that it was there before. So that clearly had an impact. They were clearly no longer the 20th largest city in the country. The NFL, as it moves into the 30s and 40s, moves to bigger cities. They wanted to play in Chicago, New York, and then later in the 40s, they're moving to the West Coast in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And so I think that had certainly a lot to do with it. By the time the American Football League comes around, Boston is a much bigger city than Providence. They're the wealthy city, not Providence. And so I think that's why it transitions to, to Boston away from Providence, though. Boston did play some preseason games in Providence in the early 60s at Mount Pleasant High School, a couple at Brown University. The Pittsburgh Steelers had their training camp in Rhode Island for 3 or 4 years in the 60s. So they weren't completely irrelevant. They had a team in the Atlantic Coast Football League, which was a strong minor league system in the early 60s. In fact, the Providence Steam Roller in, I think it was 62, at the time played the longest game in pro football history in the championship game of the Atlantic Coast Football League. So they tried to keep a pro team or slash a semi-pro team that Providence had for many years because of Pierce B. Johnson, really up until through about 1965. And then is when their, kind of quote pro football completely died there.
All right, 2 names before we go that I got to call up because they're both in the Pro Football Hall of Fame for different reasons. I think maybe perceptions and certainly a lot of time elapsed between the two of them getting in. One is Jimmy Conzelman. This guy was I don't want to call him a mythical figure, but he was quite something in the 1920s. And the steamroller was I won't call it his apex, but he was a player and coach, especially including 1928 for the championship.
Yes, he was a player and coach. 27, 28, and 29, he was a player and coach, and then 30, he was just a coach. In 27, he played very well, and then in 28, he was injured partway through the season, about halfway through the season, had a knee injury, and stopped playing, but he still coached. But at the end of the season, the team gave him the most valuable player award, even though he only played half the season. That's how much his leadership meant to the team. He was the leader of the club. He's also one of the players that stayed with Mrs. Johnson. She loved him. So yeah, I mean, he was a great coach, and a very talented player until he got injured. And then he leaves after 1930. He leaves pro football completely, goes off in a bunch of other directions and does several other occupations, and then comes back to the NFL in the mid-40s and leads the Chicago Cardinals to their only NFL championship. And he led them to the championship game twice. Once they won, and 1 year they lost, which I think he probably doesn't get in the Hall of Fame if he doesn't come back and do that in Chicago. Or he would have been probably a marginal Hall of Famer, but I think that really solidified him to get into the Hall of Fame.
Very interesting. He went to the advertising career too. Really interesting character.
Exactly. Yeah.
And tell me about Fritz Pollard.
So Fritz Pollard, who, as you mentioned, got in the Hall of Fame way later. He played in the NFL long before the steamroller. He was with the Akron Pros, which is where he pretty much made his name. He was, if not the first, one of the first black players in the NFL. He was the first black coach in the NFL. The Akron Pros won the first NFL championship, only they were called the APFA at that time. They hadn't changed their name to the NFL. Interesting, at that time, the Akron Pros season was over in 1925. Providence still had 4 games to play, one of which was against Red Grange in the first NFL night game. So Providence signed him for the last 4 games of the season. And so he only played with the Steamroller for those 4 games. And then the following year, he went back to Akron. The Steamroller also signed 2 of the Notre Dame's 4 horsemen for the game in Boston as well, to kind of try to compete.
And I'm guessing there was a familiarity with him because he went to Brown for college, right? I'm assuming he played there too.
That is correct. And he's one of the players in the Brown Athletic Hall of Fame for his time at Brown.
There you go. Yep. That's interesting. It's like you pull a thread. It just gets more and more interesting. Okay, a couple of other things to sort of wrap up here to put a bow on this. Go back to the name Steamroller again. We talked about its origin, but tell me, like, in the annals of history, right, as you go back, and I'm not talking about the other teams that sort of came around and even at other sports and stuff. Is it officially Steam Space Roller as the name, or were they ever known as the Steamrollers, either officially or colloquially, or is there conjecture as to that, given maybe what maybe sports writers lazily might have written as the name?
No, it was the steamroller. The Providence Journal always had it as the steamroller. The only time they were called rollers was for away newspaper reporters. Would may have called them the plural, but in Providence it was well known that they were singular. And you don't see that mistake in the Providence Journal.
And two words, not one word.
Two words, not one word. Yep.
And I think you forgot a word there. Damn it. Two words, damn it, and but singular, damn it, right? I mean, so but that's interesting though to me. I mean, the officialness of that to me is intriguing, and frankly should be remembered, because you see that there's some loose, as people look back and try to remember and unearth stuff, um, the facts can kind of get a little convoluted and it may seem kind of small and insignificant, but not to them, right, and not to the team. I think it's important to make sure that the accuracy I think that's important. I mean, you've spent quite a bit of time, almost 300 pages, getting into, just about every nook and cranny of this team, and it's important, I think, to remember that that's indeed what they were called.
Yes, without a doubt. I need to make sure that Charles Coppen's legacy is preserved.
Okay, and speaking of that leads into my last question. So we kind of get our shorts in a knot a lot of times around, especially teams that don't exist anymore or have landed hard into a cul-de-sac of history. In your mind, and maybe in actuality, where should and or does this team's history live, either in a current team's incarnation or maybe informally? Is it literally just in the streets of Providence and in any history museums that exist there, or is there any team or any other thing that could sort of point to the steamroller, the original steamroller in Providence, as their birth or their beginnings, so to speak? Obviously, there's no team that directly came from them, right? That exists today, but
no, the disappointment for me, and I am pursuing it so far without success. I would love to get two historical markers put up in Providence, one at the site of the Cycledrome, and the second at the site of the first NFL night game ever played. They do have a preservation society in Providence. There's a process you have to go through. The biggest challenge for me right now is both sites are owned by corporations that I have to gain their approval before I can go to the Preservation Society to get approval to put a marker up. And so far, I haven't been able to get those two corporations to give me the okay to do that. I think once if they do that, I don't think I'll have problems getting the Preservation Society to approve them.
May I ask what the challenge is for each of them? Like, what is
just one has been completely non-responsive. The other, I think they're going through an internal process. In fact, I wrote a note before the call that I have to follow up with the manager like this week, because it's been like almost 4 weeks since I talked to her last. And they were going through an internal process of approval. So hopefully, and that was for the first night game. So we'll see. The other one I have not heard back from, and I probably again need to follow up. I'm not sure I have the right person.
And then I guess the other sort of last question on that would be: would it be a stretch to, in today's pro games, pick your sport, right? I mean, the nostalgia thing is certainly, it's become kind of a moneymaker in some respect. I mean, okay, maybe not for the right reasons, but if there was ever a throwback to this team and a memory, an anniversary of some sort, where could that even live? Would it be with the Patriots, or would that be too loose an affiliation just because of the geography?
Well, it's kind of a loose affiliation, but interesting you bring that up. So at the Patriots Hall of Fame, they do tell the story of New England pro football. They do have a jersey on display from the steamroller. It may be the only one that exists. And I actually did talk to them 2 weeks ago about carrying my book. And again, they told me their buyer would get in touch with me if he was interested in selling the book, and I haven't heard from him. But there is definitely a tie to the Patriots because, when you think about it geographically, Foxborough is as close to Providence as it is to Boston.
Exactly.
And they are the New England Patriots, not the Boston Patriots. So you would think that would be the tie. The other tie certainly could be the Rhode Island Historical Society. And they were very helpful, obviously, in my research and in the book. But I don't know that they want to go down that path.
Yeah, it just seems that the NFL has become, I think, a little bit more embracing of its history, especially as sort of the, these neat numerical anniversaries sort of approach, and I'm not sure it was always that way. But yeah, I mean, I think it gets to be challenging, especially during these earliest years of the NFL's existence, when, as you mentioned before, there was a lot of ragtagness to the schedules and uneven schedules and play and amateurism and, all kinds of things that weren't there were lots of looseness to those things. And, I'm sure there are a lot of leagues out there that just don't necessarily want to recall those early days when they didn't, they weren't the most, successful professional league in the planet. Right.
Right. But when
it does have to live somewhere.
Yeah. And when you peel back the steamroller, they did so many NFL firsts. I mean, they were innovative. They did a lot of things that are significant in NFL history. And so you shouldn't lose that just because they're a defunct team. They carry a big part of NFL history. Yeah.
And you don't want to, sorry, I have to say it, steamroll that history into oblivion. And I think that's why this book is really, I think, a great contribution to, and I think not just from a researcher's perspective, right, which is, important stuff, but I think just into the tableau of history and the history of the game of football. It certainly was very much a team that was part of the very formative years that were, without which you wouldn't have this monstrosity of a league and such a successful sport as you would today. So it's very important, I think, to have this in the annals, if you will, and kudos, because I think it's a story that needs to be remembered, and I think now we have probably the definitive work of such.
Well, thank you. Yes, it is definitely the most significant book written about the steamroller. There were two other that were really more focused on the championship season and were, like self-published type things. So, and there's some inconsistencies and inaccuracies in those. So this is definitely the definitive history of the franchise.
All righty. Many thanks to Greg. And who knew? Providence, Rhode Island, the hub of the first NFL football franchise to be domiciled in New England. I did not know that. And I'm sure that some of our listeners didn't know that either. If you did know that, boy, oh boy, you have lots of time on your hands. It is the Providence Steam Roller, New England's first NFL team. It is available in paperback. That's the title of the book. It's available in paperback, also in Kindle versions, by our guest this week, Greg Tranter. And you can, of course, go to our website at Good Seats Still Available. Search up this episode 374 with Greg and me, and you will find some convenient links to Amazon to get either the paperback or Kindle versions of said book. It's fascinating. Pictures and all kinds of stuff. And I highly encourage you to not only get a copy of the book, but go on YouTube and check out the full mini doc that we grabbed that sound from at the beginning, called One Steamroller, the mini doc that's produced by the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Again, Eric Welschenbach is the guy who posted that on YouTube. And you can also find there, if you search around there, you'll find there's some footage, no sound, of a game from 1927, right? This will be the second or third year of the Providence's participation in the NFL. The Framingham Lion Tamers, who were a semi-pro / amateur squad at the time, playing the Providence Steam Roller. It is fascinating, even though there's no audio. It's 5 minutes of just a raw film goodness that is just really intriguing to watch. What else? I think you can find some stuff on Facebook, if I'm not mistaken, for Greg. Just search him up there. But of course, if you really want to get a sense of Greg's passion for early days pro football, you must check out the Buffalo History Museum website. It's buffalohistory.org. And just search up the Greg D. Tranter collection of Buffalo Bills memorabilia. We're talking thousands of items, a whole bunch that are digitized for your enjoyment there on the website. But make yourself a visit next time you're up in Buffalo to go visit in person the Buffalo History Museum. I think they're open. They're closed Mondays and Tuesdays, but they're open every other day of the week. And I got to think that there's a whole bunch of stuff. I think there's something in the order of tens of thousands of archival items, including programs and tickets and publications and all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure what's physically available to see or what you got to make an appointment to see, but check it all out there. And again, that's the Greg D. Tranter collection of Buffalo Bills memorabilia at the Buffalo History Museum. All right. While you're online, after you've exhausted yourself by looking at all the digital images there, why don't you go to our website again at goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where we post all of our episodes. If somehow, for whatever reason, you're not subscribing or following us in your favorite podcast catcher, feeder, whatever that is, or deliverer, we post them all there. If you want to point people to the website to give them a taste of the show, you can do that. Go to our merch section. Why don't you? Lots of great stuff there. We've got stuff from our pals at oldschoolshirts.com and royalretros.com, as well as from tpublic.com. You can buy us a cup of coffee, proverbially, with a link there from our friends at Ko-Fi, and just all kinds of stuff. Our email address is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can follow us on the various socials. We are at Good Seats Still on Twitter X, and just about everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available, including most aggressively of late on Blue Sky. Check us out there. We post a lot of stuff there. We post a lot of stuff at Threads as well. But you'll find us also at Facebook. We post all of our shows at YouTube, all those kinds of places. Check them out. Thank you, Jerry Payne, of course, for your knob twiddling excellence this week. Mr. Payne Audio Excellence to the rescue. And thank you for listening and supporting the show. Much more coming up for you through the holidays and beyond. Very intriguing conversations to be coming your way. And we thank you for listening and supporting the show. Hope your holiday season's going well so far, and we'll see you next week.